Good afternoon for those of you here in Europe. Good morning, good evening for anyone else. And I'd like to welcome you to the last full panel of the day. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the sponsor of the project and also of the day for this as a whole, for this activity as a whole. This particular panel and also the keynote address that will follow were jointly organized with a second project on future of work, for which I'm one of the principals. That's a project sponsored by the European Union, the European External Action Service. It's a transatlantic expert group on the future of work. So my thanks to both of those. And indeed, our theme has a great deal to do with both. Here what we're talking about is the productivity effects of artificial intelligence. Are there transatlantic differences? Now, we're going to be followed, as I said, by a keynote. It will be by Professor Erika Brynolfsson of Stanford University. Part of the reason why this is late in the European day was to make it possible for him to speak without giving him a brutally early start time. But my hope is that this panel will actually help to set the stage for that subsequent keynote address. Now, as with the other panels today, we're going to be trying to leave time for question and answer. We'll be taking live questions and answers from the room. For those of you out there in radio land, so to speak, you can send questions to us direct from the website or using slido.com with a keyword of #work, capital W-O-R-K. And we're hoping to hear from you. I'll be trying to take questions from both. The session will have to end promptly since we have to make clear time for the keynote to follow and also give them a moment to reset up the room. So that really, I think, is all of the homework that we need. Now, by way of introducing the topic, anytime that we talk about productivity and any form of digitalization or ICTs, it's natural to start with the so-called Solow paradox. Solow remarked years ago that the computer age is everywhere to be seen except in the productivity numbers. And so a natural question is that still the case? It was a long time ago. What we're likely to be hearing from Professor Brynolfsson, based on recent published work that he's done, also with one of my Bruegel colleagues, Yorios Petropoulos, is a claim that productivity has actually jumped in the United States, and he's hoping that we've hit a good point on the J-curve and that could it actually accelerate back to levels that we haven't seen since the 90s. So this really opens a lot of interesting questions for us in this discussion. Now, we have some very talented, very senior panelists here. We have Andrea Glorioso, who is a policy officer for the European Commission, DG Employment. Due to a very dense schedule, he's joining us, but from Radio Land also remotely. We have Francis Hinterman from Accenture, and we have Arturo Franco from the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, our sponsor for the project and for the day. So with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to Andrea. And I think the two main questions I'd like to pose to you really relate to your own experience. First off, how do you see artificial intelligence and productivity? And relatedly, given that you spent, I think, 4 years as a diplomatic officer for the European Union working out of Washington, how do you see the differences between Europe and the United States in this regard? And with that, over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and my apologies for not being able to be there in person as I would have liked. I think that I'm not going to jump into a discussion about the numbers, as the keynote speaker after me will do that much better than I could ever hope to do. I would like, however, to point out that we do need, or I think we do need, to look at the issue at stake from a slightly broader perspective than pure productivity, or from a pure broad perspective of productivity as economists are trying to do. And by this, I don't mean to suggest that productivity is unimportant, and obviously that measuring productivity is unimportant. I don't mean that for all the reasons that I don't think I need to explain in this context. But for productivity to appear, of course, there has to be adoption of a technology. And that adoption has to be widespread. That technology has to work properly, which I would argue artificial intelligence in some cases is already doing. In other cases, I would say still a bit of a promise, at least at scale and at least in certain sectors and industries. But the point that here for me is really important is the one of adoption. And adoption adoption comes from different sources and can be seen from different dimensions. And usually my impression is that very often we look at adoption of artificial intelligence using as a proxy investments. Meaning if we see, and by the way, the European Commission has done it not only, but has also done it as part of our various impact assessments. And basically that boils down to saying, well, if companies are investing X amount of money into artificial intelligence technologies, that means that artificial intelligence technologies are working well, and therefore from there, a number of policy conclusions are drawn. And this is not wrong per se, it is a useful proxy, but at the same time, especially when we look at adoption of artificial intelligence in productive process, in the public and especially in the private sector, we also need, I believe that we need to look a little bit more closely at how workers, at how in the workplace, artificial intelligence technologies or digital technologies in general, or any new technology is actually adopted. And without getting too much into detail, because I don't believe we have the time, but let me just say that quite often analysis fails to grasp to what extent a simple investment by one or more companies into a particular technology says very little on how in practice that technology is used rather than bypassed in the workplace. And that is an angle where I think we do need, and by we I mean collectively, also including us, we do need to invest quite a bit more attention. It's moving the analysis more and more to the extent possible to the firm organizational level, going beyond what we have done so far, which was necessary and very useful. That was an analysis more at the macro level. In terms of comparison between Europe and the US, I actually, indeed, you are correct that I spent 4 years as a diplomat in Washington, DC, and traveling quite a bit across the US, but also before becoming a diplomat, I had also traveled a lot and had a lot of different engagements with US organizations, both as I was working for the Commission and before that. And my impression is that I haven't seen the numbers that our keynote speaker will show us, and I'm very curious to see those. At the same time, I think it's also important to look at not only productivity, which again is a very important metric, but also at quality of life. We also need to look how different technologies not only increase mere productivity of different companies, but how they increase our overarching and overall quality of life. And that has many more dimensions than mere productivity. And I don't want to be undiplomatic, but I do have to say that my experience in the US, which is a country that I love quite a bit, is that there has been a lot of attention on the impact of technology on productivity, on economic growth, which is very important. A little bit less on the impact of digital technologies and artificial intelligence on a broader quality of life. And perhaps I will stop here and listen to what the other speakers have to say about this.
Well, thank you, Andrea. A quick question. I know that what Brynolfsson has written is that part of the reason why it takes a long time for new technologies to really manifest gains is that there have to be accompanying changes in business processes, in skills, and also accumulation of intangible assets. I think that's pretty much in line with what you said.
I think that indeed, goes to prove that what I'm saying is not particularly novel, but it's something where I think we do need to focus a little bit more. And I would add an additional element that in order for digital technologies to have to diffuse and have the effects that we all hope they would have in terms of productivity, but not only, there also has to be acceptance. And acceptance has many, many dimensions, but it also has to do with the narrative, with the story that we tell about new technologies. Because if we tell workers that the new technologies will replace them unless they do something, let me just say, I'm not sure that's a narrative that will fly or that is flying very well in a lot of sectors, also in the US, by the way, not only Europe. So I agree with additional elements that you introduced, Scott, but I would also add that I think we do need to engage more than we're currently doing. And again, the we is very collective here. We need to engage more with workers to make them understand what is in it for them with the adoption of technologies such as artificial intelligence.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that leads very naturally into themes that Arturo Franco covers. Arturo is a senior vice president at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. And through your connections with MasterCard and also through the center, I'm sure that you deal a great deal with U.S. business. So I think you'll have some very valuable perspectives here. I'd be interested in your view on really what AI's impact on productivity is likely to be, what its impact on labor markets is likely to be. This flows, I think, very naturally from the point that Andrea was just making. Also, what sorts of AI are most likely to deliver inclusive growth, shared prosperity? So with that, over to you, Arturo.
I'll try to be brief with I think, very existential questions there. Let me just start with that solo paradox. It's interesting. I think he referred to it in the 70s or 80s. It definitely played out with the ICT revolution in the 90s, where you saw kind of like this confluence of a slowdown in productivity in the US exactly at the time when this innovation in like microprocessing computers was happening. And so that's why it's presented as a paradox. Some data on the adoption piece, which would be kind of like the first hypothesis of why it doesn't have immediate effect. The McKinsey Global Institute did a historical review of 25 technologies that were kind of recently adopted and asked how long they took to get to 90% adoption. And the kind of average span is between 8 and 28 years. So I don't know when we kind of declare the beginning of the AI era, but I might have to sit and wait for a little bit to see it pop up in productivity. I think the second hypothesis, before turning to the labor market effects that I would throw out, would be about concentration. We know that AI, as Andrea said, is still very highly concentrated in a handful of Western countries. We did a study with Tufts University on the top 50 hotspots for AI, looking at not just investment, as Andrea said, but also talent and diversity and the equity that's being produced. So these are 50 global cities that were ranked in terms of AI development. The number one city is not a surprise, San Francisco, or more broadly the Bay Area, has a level of investment and talent attraction that is bigger than the next four cities, which are Boston, Seattle, and Bangalore, among others. So the concentration geographically is massive. By the way, there's only 2 European cities in the top 20, which are Paris and Berlin, which come, I think, around 18 and 19. And before that, there's 4 Indian cities in terms of AI creation and adoption. So we might want to start talking about the Indian Ocean instead of the Atlantic Ocean in terms of AI. I think that the third hypothesis is that we know that all of these technological revolutions take time. The previous technological revolutions had been agnostic, if not supportive, of low-skilled workers. If you think about the agricultural revolution, if you think about the industrial revolution, they actually created more jobs. Even the golden age of manufacturing, which created a large middle class in the US, which was a backbone of European development, there was a correlation between productivity and median wages, right? So people's workers' incomes were moving in tandem with productivity gains. What's happened in the last few waves of automation and robotization, and what is very likely going to happen with AI, is that this relationship has been broken for a while. And what happens there is that if you think about productivity, a productivity event is when a machine, a technology can do something better than a human. That human is then left to do other things. But if you do not re-employ that human in a productive part of the economy, then you do not get the productivity gain. Like if you measure total factor productivity, that person is out of the labor market. And so what happened with automation, we've talked about the polarization of jobs and wages. We've seen research from David Autor and Daron Acemoglu on the hollowing out of middle income jobs. We've seen this kind of break between average wages and median wages and what people call high skilled biased development, right? And so AI is just another wave of a type of technological development that is leading to an economy that has very high paying jobs and very low paying jobs, right? And so to answer the question about inclusive growth, what we need to do with AI is that we need to be intentional in understanding first, how is it going to be shared in terms of benefits between kind of the capital owners and labor, right? And so we launched 2 years ago at the Partnership on AI an initiative called the Shared Prosperity Initiative, which I've been privileged enough to sit in the steering committee of. And the question that we are asking is, how can we make sure that AI leads to shared prosperity, that the most people can benefit from that? And the conclusion that we got to, just to finish here, is that there is nothing in the technology that is pushing us to make it high skill biased, or that it's pushing us to make it labor saving or labor destroying. AI could very well be labor augmenting, human centric, and lead to a more inclusive economy. But we need to have the governance, we need to have the metrics, and we need to make sure that the jobs that are being produced are better jobs, and that the jobs that are being destroyed are replaced in the economy.
That's a really thoughtful perspective. Now, I think in line with the previous panel, that probably implies, once again, a real rethinking of our educational system, maybe a shift to lifelong learning, so that people that are in jobs that are altered, if not displaced, have someplace to go.
Yeah, I mean, that is one piece of the puzzle, but I think that puts the onus on the worker. I think the folks that are making decisions today on applying AI are policymakers and employers, right? And so I would like to actually also focus on the responsibility of those kind of either making the decisions or allowing others to make decisions with implications for many people's jobs. There is a term that Daron Acemoglu coined, which is so-so technologies. And we need to be afraid of the proliferation of so-so technologies. And I'll give you an example just to finish. Land Pritchett, a professor from Harvard now at Oxford, has a beautiful thesis on how technology creates a dual problem. It cannibalizes low-skilled workers, and it's being used to increase the productivity of high-skilled workers. And the example that he uses is self-check-in in airports, right? And he has this beautiful image, which he lived himself, of being in the New Delhi airport with the beautiful new self-check-in machines inside the airport and a line of 1,000 people interviewing for one job in the airport outside. And that doesn't make any sense, right? In a context where like labor is the biggest kind of commodity around, why do you make people use their own productivity to do something as simple as checking in? So this idea of so-so technologies, of using AI in things that really don't create more productivity, that actually they're using my time for me to go and check in, so they're reducing my productivity, if you can think about it that way. I think is a good call out on where this technology could lead us into more exclusion.
It's interesting. So it could be either heaven or hell.
Yeah.
That's a great insight. Thank you. So I'd like to give a chance now to Francis Hinterman. Francis is the executive director of Accenture Research. And I think what I'd like to toss out to you is a question, first off, on whether artificial intelligence, in your view, is a game changer. And if so, where and for whom? Does it have different effects in different countries? And in particular, you deal with a lot of firms. Are there firms that do it better, firms that do it worse? What makes the difference?
No, it's excellent questions. Most of work is at company level. So to come back to a question of Andrea later, not at the macro level, but the micro level at company organization level. And we've been researching on AI for a number of years now, and we just completed one research post-COVID and to compare with pre-COVID. And so what we have seen are three things to answer your question. First of all, indeed, AI is a game changer for some companies. In the sample that we look at, which is 1,200 companies around the world, 16 industries, 15 countries, so pretty broad-based. We've seen that something like 12%, so 1 in 8 companies are at a point in advancing their AI maturity into the business organization. So it's really giving them a superior competitive advantage. We speak about growth, we speak about profitability, we speak as well about investment in non-financial KPIs like reducing the carbon footprint and this type of thing. So we can see that group. And if we compare pre-pandemic, we can see an acceleration. We just finished one research on the similar sample just before the pandemic hit. And at that point in time, there was a smaller group of companies hitting that level of maturity. So really what we have seen throughout the pandemic, and we know that there's been an acceleration of investment in digital, broadly speaking, in AI as well in particular, we've seen this acceleration, and we see that going back to the J curve or the S curve, what we used to see as an S curve in terms of the way that digital has been spreading around industries and companies, we see something coming to a J curve here. So there is a real sense of acceleration. And the third thing is that is really broad-based. I mean, lots of people will think intuitively that it's first and foremost the tech industry, and of course the tech industry is implementing what they preach to others first, but it's not only the tech industry. You can see that in the retail industry, in the manufacturing industry, in the automotive industry, in life science, of course, aerospace and defense, so it's quite broad-based. And for me, the litmus test is always health and public services. When we look back, in terms of the way that the digital transformation has been spreading across industries, health and public services were the laggards. And what we can see here on AI is that actually there are some pretty significant level of investment as well in the health industry and in public services. Now, going back to the point of Andrea, it's not because we speak about investment that necessarily, you see that in terms of output and in terms of benefits for everybody. So the point to highlight here is that in this minority of companies, the 12% I was mentioning, which are now at a point where really AI is bringing them some competitive advantage. The interesting bit, I think, to answer one of the questions of Andrea is that yes, it is about technology, and there is some investment in core AI technologies which are done. It's about re-platforming to the cloud. We can come back to that later if you like, but it's not about technology only. It's about what we call human ingenuity. It's about the way that really this type of skills is enhancing the people, the staff in the companies. And going back to your point, we've been researching several times about the point of views of leadership, let's say C-level executives and employees. And where we could see the gap is actually not the employees complaining about AI, it's about the companies asking to get some more training to get upskilled, because it's complementarity, right? Looking at AI and people. And some amount of leaders not having a sense of that, but still in the mode about what about the staff, they will not keep up, we have to replace them, and so on and so forth. So that's where we saw the gap. And the companies which are at this frontier that I was mentioning earlier on, they managed to close that gap. And actually that means massive investment in the skills of the people, in the talents. And we can see that across various functions, whether you speak about HR, whether you speak about customer relationship management, security, and now getting into production, because that's where you really make a difference ultimately, is when you put AI at the core of a production, whether it's a production of in the manufacturing or whether it's production in service. Actually, we've been doing some deep dive on some implementation of what we call RPS, or robotization process automation, in some companies. So some real longitudinal research where you measure the type of investment which is made with a certain amount of people, and then we follow them for 2 years, and we compare where they are 2 years later versus the beginning. And when we do this deep dive, what we see again and again is that, yes, there is an increase of productivity when we got some specific measurement of it, and lots of the workers get upskilled on the way. So there is that type of virtuous circle can exist. I'm not saying it's implemented everywhere, but we can see that type of virtuous circle can happen.
That's impressive. Thank you very much for that. Just a quick note to the staff. First, I keep hearing scratching noises on the audio. If you can figure out what that is and get rid of it, it would be appreciated. Second, I seem to have lost my screen here with the Slido, so if someone could bring it back, it would be appreciated. But we don't need the Slido for the next moment, because I think at this point we've had a very good perspective from all of the speakers on the issues that we need to be thinking about. And I'd like to turn things over for questions. As in the previous panels, I'll do that first, taking questions from people in the room. And so if you could simply put up your hands and I'll call on you. And we need to bring a microphone over to you. Please wait, because otherwise Andrea won't hear and the audience won't in remote. So I saw a hand there. Who else was asking? Normally we take 2 or 3 questions. Good, I see another one in the back. And the third one. Good, so we'll take 3 questions and then we'll go for answers.
I wanted to ask you if you see a role in fiscal policy in promoting, so to say, as you put it nicely, the technology to really be a labor augmenting, and what would be the most effective policy mix given the sustainability of public finance matters.
Okay, thank you. And over to, I think it was Mr. Van de Van there. But please identify yourself when you ask the question and identify who you work for, even though we know who you are.
Yeah, I'm Niels van Weeren, working for Randstad. So my question is about the adoption of AI, stuff like that, across sectors. I think the gentleman from Accenture already touched on it. In my view, you see an interesting phenomenon that, there are laggards and there are sectors that are further ahead. You mentioned health sector. I think interesting. When started, radiologists, used a machine to look at, let's say, breast cancer prediction. That was not a decade ago, but and illegal. I think those are typically laggards. So, what is your view on across sectors, why it takes longer in certain sectors than in others?
Thank you.
Davor Mishkulin, AMC Burning Glass. Very quick question. I'm not economist by training, but follow the field. Should we maybe, or is there thinking in the right circles about how do we measure productivity? And is it the time to change the instrument? What we really, like I recently read about, it's actually all about, let's say, dollar output per worker. And I know the people know Tesla, it's around $730,000 per worker. Is this the better measure than, I think at the moment it's based on hours?
Okay, that's some good questions. So I think following the procedure we normally do, I think what I'll do is give each of the panelists an opportunity to answer. Actually, to make it interesting, why don't we take the opposite sequence of what we did for the initial interventions? So Francis, why don't we give you a chance to jump in first? I think you'll have something to say probably on all of those. I'll
be brief on On the question of industries, we could speak about it for a long time. I think, as you mentioned, specifically health, there are some specific regulations in health that you don't have necessarily in other industries, and I would say for good reason, right? Because it's playing, so to speak, with our lives. So it's that explains parts of it. When you get into the public sector, it's got a lot to do with the specific processes of the public sector, I would say. And what is interesting here, at least from what we measured recently, is that we can see that this intent, and it's an intent at this point in time, but this intent to invest a lot more in AI in the coming years, all things being equal, of course, we can see that really broad-based in all industries. And it's more, the difference is going to be more within companies, and it's not due to the specific industries to which they belong. So that's a point I would say on that. On the question of measuring productivity, I'm not in position to decide the way to measure productivity, but the way I could answer that, to your point, is when we look at the impact of implementing AI on workers, we do not look only at the kind of value add per person measurement, which is purely financial. We speak ourselves about what we call net better off, and net better off is a 360 view of workers when we look at the financials, of course, but we look as well at a series of non-financial indicators in terms of well-being of the workers, in terms of the way they feel connected or not in their work with others. I was here this morning, I heard a lot about the question of hybrid workplace. Actually, we think that it's time to not to move away from that question, but to ask another question. And the other question to ask is, how do employers contribute to enhance the way that people are connected to each other's peers, but as well their leaders. We call that from always connected to omni-connected. And when we say omni-connected, it's not to be always connected. That's not that. It's to be connected with all the people you work with. And in our view, it's becoming a critical factor. And that's what we put into the way that we assess when we introduce AI. For instance, we assess the positive or negative effects of implementing AI. And I could go on other factors. There are 6 of them overall, but I think it's getting into your direction of measuring some very important non-financial indicators.
That's interesting. That seems to naturally line up with some discussions we had at the beginning of the day about job quality, which clearly is not so. It's not just about compensation. There's a lot that goes into job quality. Well, Arturo, would you like to jump in on the questions that we got in this round?
Yeah, quite quickly. So I would take the question about measuring productivity a little bit deeper, which is, I agree with Mariana Matsukato's take on value. We need to rethink how we think about the economy, who's included, who's excluded, whose work is counted, what work is counted, and go deeper into those conversations about what is value. I would question like the relationship between the price of the output in that case, for example. I think that's where the issue might be. On the sectors, the 2 timelines I think that I like to follow. One is obviously on the work that Francis and others do on which sectors are adopting AI. Obviously started closer to the digital tech sectors. It moved into retail. Now it's moving to kind of human capital and some services. I think a big chunk of GDP still sits in heavy industries, in things like construction, etc. And there have been some interesting innovations where AI is applicable. For example, in mining, I learned with Peter over there at a Monk School conference about this concept of digital twinning, where you can model your mine digitally and then do all kinds of things to see if it's safe or to see what you're going to get out of your mine. So you can use the artificial intelligence to do mining. And so I think as AI applications move into some of the more traditional sectors, that's where I think we might be seeing the biggest growth in productivity, which I guess we're going to hear from now. And I think that second timeline, just to finish, that is more interesting to me, the timeline of the development of the actual intelligence, right? Because here we are talking about back-end applications, almost like glorified modeling and statistics, like machine learning at some point, some learning from the computer, but nothing out of kind of proportion. There is this fictional timeline to general artificial intelligence, which opens up all kinds of new opportunities, right? When the computer can actually learn anything that we could learn as humans. And when that happens, if that happens, then you open up to the computer being able to drive a car fully, to operate on you, to become a doctor, to become a lawyer, to become whatever the computer wants to become. And so I think that's the other really relevant timeline. It's a little bit weird to think about it, but people are working hard on making that a reality, and that will be a step change in productivity when that happens. And sorry, taxing robots would be the answer on the fiscal side.
There you go. Okay. Yes. Well, Andrea, over to you. Any thoughts?
Thank you.
There's a lot of things to chew on here.
Yes, really a lot, and we don't have time to chew on all of them, but I'll try to briefly react. I will try not to repeat what the other speakers have said, which not only in reaction to this question, but also what I said before, I have to say quite broadly in agreement. I would say that I heard three questions. The first two were how to make technology more labor augmenting. And the second, why do certain types of technology, in particular artificial intelligence, take longer to be adopted, diffuse, and have positive effects, including in terms of productivity in certain sectors rather than others? There are, of course, different reasons, but I think that the two phenomena are actually connected. And in my view, a strong point of connection is meaning if you want technology to be truly labor augmenting and if you want technology to be adopted more quickly in all sectors, you have to talk to people who work. You have to talk to the people who work in the company, in the firm, in the sector. And by people who work, I mean not only the managers, not only the analysts, not only the entrepreneurs, who are very important stakeholders, to be clear, but also to the employees, to the workers. Because once you do, you might have a very different understanding of how the technology, which kind of technologies are actually needed, which kind of processes actually need optimization, whether using technology or otherwise, and so on and so forth. And this, in my view, is very often lacking in analysis, certainly in many of the analyses that I see, where you have this very abstract view of how a particular sector or firm works, because nobody talks to the actual workers, and then somebody comes up with a technological solution that does not actually respond to the problem at hand, and then one should not be surprised if that solution is not adopted by workers, it does not have positive effects in terms of productivity, and so on and so forth. So I would really insist on this point that involving, while keeping, everybody has their role. I'm not arguing for some kind of socialist revolution here, to be clear, or to create a collective ownership of the means of production. I'm not arguing for that, but I am saying that there is a significant role to play for social dialogue, for workers' council, for a more direct involvement in whichever way people find it the best way to do it, a much stronger involvement of workers in the process of identifying the best use of artificial intelligence or whatever type of technology for that matter. And then I did want to add a very small point, I guess, on the question of, is it time to change how to measure productivity? Look, productivity, as we understand it today, has one huge advantage, which there is a wide and broad understanding, common understanding of what it means, and it is by no means obvious for many measurements, for many means of measurement that we use, and it is fairly easy to calculate. I know that there is a lot of work going on finding other metrics and criteria to measure things, and these are all good, but if I can be a bit pragmatic here from a policymaker perspective, you also need measures and measurements that have a meaning in the moment when you make the policy. There is no point in coming, or there is, in my view, little point in coming up with new means of measuring productivity, which are so complicated, where the data is so difficult to obtain, that we can at best have a sense of what things were 10 years ago. That is not helpful in terms of policy making. I'm sure it can make you publish a lot of papers, but I'm not sure it's very helpful in terms of policy making. And the point here, and with this I will close, is the fact that we measure the productivity is fairly, it has all the qualities that I express, which is why I don't think we should stop using productivity. Does not mean that productivity should be the only way to measure things, or should be the only criteria with which to judge whether a certain policy makes sense or not. After all, in the short term, if we really wanted to increase productivity in a sector, there is an easy way to do it. And before anybody jumps up, this is a hypothetical scenario. You could just kill half of the workers and oblige the other half to work double the time, or double the speed, and probably you would increase productivity. But all of us would say, well, no, that's not a very smart way to increase productivity for all a series of other reasons. And it's the other reason that we need to keep into account when we think about the overall policy environment in which we are operating.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, on that last one, you're talking about how we measure productivity being clear. I think you're probably focused especially on labor productivity, which is often expressed as something like GDP divided by hours worked, something like that, as distinct from
specifically to labor productivity.
Right, as distinct from total factor productivity, which also looks at capital. Yeah. Okay, so with that, we can move on to questions from the remote audience. And one of them I'd like to toss out to begin with is on the difference between EU and US in introducing and regulating AI. Do you envisage further divergence or ultimate convergence in the future? So are there any thoughts on that one? Actually one that came in when I wasn't looking is, I think, an interesting one from Hendrik. The one above was from Lucy, this one from Hendrik. Could AI be implemented together with universal basic income? As some of you might know, a few years ago in particular, when some of the research literature was suggesting that a huge number of jobs would be destroyed by artificial intelligence, which, by the way, most experts don't believe today. But the concern was that if we're all going to be out of work, do we need universal basic income so that we aren't all living in extreme poverty? So those, I think, are two pretty good ones. I'd like to toss those around. Why don't we take a different sequence this time? Arturo, would you like to go first?
Yes, happy to. I mean, I think that is the worry that I was talking about of this association between productivity gains and increasing well-being for workers. I think it's playing out in AI. I mean, previous technological revolutions created more jobs than what they took away, and that's been true for the 20th century, basically up to 1980, right? And so if AI is going to be able to create as many jobs as it destroys, and those jobs are not just high-skilled jobs, but are actually labor augmenting or human augmenting of low-skilled workers, then I think that we should embrace the technology. What the Shared Prosperity Initiative says is that first, the trend doesn't seem to be naturally going in that direction, because inclusive growth is something that you only achieve, as I said, with intentionality. And second, I mean, you would have to end with all of a series of welfare, fiscal kind of innovations if, as Daniel Susskind put it in a book, A World Without Work, if AI really gets to this level where it can replace, almost any task that we can do. And as we learned from the first panel today on job quality, just because you can automate a task doesn't mean that you have to, right? And so we need to think about the workers. We need to think about the effects on the labor market in general and productivity. And then we need to think about the inclusiveness of the benefits that are being produced by this technology.
Thank you. Those are good observations. I think, by the way, even Elon Musk recently was saying that he thought maybe they'd gone a little too far in trying to automate everything that could be automated. So second thoughts are coming to the fore now. Any thoughts on universal basic income?
So I followed the Finland example quite closely. The US currently has about 40 experiments in different cities. They're very early days. The longest standing is in Stockton, California. And if you read a great Dutch historian who wrote the book about how UBI has been along for many decades. Canada had a big exercise back in the 70s, I believe. And I think that it is outside of the debate of technology and the future of work. I think it is a response to or an acknowledgement of the precariousness of human capital in many developed countries, the underinvestment, the chronic underinvestment, particularly in underserved communities, in their education, in their health, in an economy that's, again, increasingly polarized in both jobs and wages. And what I take from the Finnish example and to some extent from the Stockton example is that many of the young people who got a basic income turned entrepreneurial and actually created a business. And so I think that that would be a sustainable way of doing it if people actually use that opportunity to innovate, to create kind of more value for the future.
That's a really interesting observation. Why don't we let Andrea respond next?
Sure. I'm not sure you can see me on screen because I see a big, there I am. Hi.
Good. There we go.
There, yeah. Look, on the first question, which is about alignment between the EU and the US on artificial intelligence, I think we are already seeing a certain degree of alignment, at least in terms of the narrative about the issues, the challenges and the opportunities of artificial intelligence and other digital technologies. This is true also for other initiatives that the European Commission has put on the table, including the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, etc. We're seeing a lot of, I would say, at least common thinking, which was not necessarily the case a few years ago, including when I was serving there in Washington, which was between 2014 and 18. I think part of the reason for this is simply because if you look at the numbers, at the demographic, at the socioeconomic developments in the US, you see, as others have said already during this panel, you see a very significant pressure, which has been going on for many years now, on the middle class. You see people are starting to ask rather tough questions on who gets the benefits of the economic investments, including, to a large degree, using public money. Silicon Valley is a big success of private money, but it did receive and it continues to receive significant public support in different ways. So I guess all of this is leading people in the US to ask the same kind of questions that we are asking in Europe as well. Now, the responses are and will be different because we come from slightly different traditions in terms of cultural tradition, I would say, also political systems and so on and so forth. But I certainly see more of an approximation of views on these matters than used to be the case until not many years ago. On the point about universal basic income and artificial intelligence or automation of the technologies, look, I really don't mean to be in any way form dismissive, but I do think that the question, at least as it is posed, and I realize the limits of Slido to ask this kind of discuss about these topics, I think it's a bit of a red herring, to be honest. First, because I see nowhere in the numbers any suggestion that, at least at the current pace of technology, we're going to see such a massive forms of unemployment that would necessitate country, if not continent-wide, the policies of universal basic income because of such massive loss of jobs. We do see, of course, I don't need to tell you, we do see significant movements in some sectors, but we also, some of that is, by the way, not at all, has nothing to do with technology, and we've seen it in the past 2 years. That was not what happened, was certainly not due to artificial intelligence, what happened in the bull markets. But besides that, I think the discussions on universal basic income are quite often difficult because I used to joke that if you ask 3 people what they mean by universal basic income, you will get 3 different answers. The examples I heard, for example, so far are not universal because they were referring to measures that are targeted at people below a certain threshold. of income. That's not universal basic income. Those are basic income measures of which we already have quite a few across Europe. So look, as I said, I really don't mean to be dismissive, but I think that for this discussion to lead to some form of policy scenarios, we have at least first to agree on exactly what we mean by universal basic income, and two, to draw a very convincing line between increasing use of artificial intelligence and automation and massive scenarios of unemployment, neither of which seems to be right now in the cards, at least as far as I can see.
Thank you, Andrea. But before we move on, as far as convergence between U.S. and EU, so we have an EU-U.S. Trade and Technology Council, a TTC, which is intended to foster convergence. There isn't too much public visibility into what's actually going on there. Do you perceive it as fostering convergence in practice?
I think that the TTC is certainly fostering fostering convergence is always a tricky issue, because at the end of the day, we respond to our citizens, and our citizens might have different interests in Europe and the US, and those interests are not always aligned. We have to accept that. But certainly the TTC is fostering a lot of convergence in the questions to be asked. And as I was saying before, this to me is already a significant change. I will give you a practical example that during the Obama administration, and I speak with very direct experience, during the Obama administration, raising in the US the question whether artificial intelligence or digitalization, digital technologies could have possibly have negative impacts on labor, on works, and whether we should do something about it. It was not a discussion to be had. It was not a question to be discussed. Nowadays it is. That's a convergence in the questions that we're asking. Then, as I said, we will possibly get to slightly different responses. But the TTC, which is, by the way, as you know, it's an environment, it's a setting in which we're discussing Europe and the US are discussing a lot of different topics, including artificial intelligence. But in any case, I think it's an excellent platform to build convergence on the questions, and then hopefully at least on some of the answers as well.
Thank you very much. Actually, just to give a little perspective to the UBI answer, what had raised a lot of eyebrows a few years ago were claims in a paper by Fry and Osborne that 47% of the U.S. workforce would be unemployed within a small number of decades thanks to artificial intelligence. In that case, you really would need some pretty dramatic social policy interventions. But as I said, I don't think that, I think hardly anyone would make that claim today.
But if I can say something, we know that 40% of Americans are $300 away from bankruptcy, even if they are employed. So we must not discount underemployment as well. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And in a country with a much weaker social safety net, which is a big difference. And in fact, by the way, that also, in terms of the initial question about convergence versus divergence, important to remember that the U.S., even though some of these issues, some of the problems are similar, but solutions would necessarily be different, and even the problems themselves, for reasons you just sketched out, could look very different. So, so the question is whether we get divergence or convergence, both in the problems and especially in the solutions. I mean, Europe is not a federal republic. Even within the United States, though, social protection mechanisms are hugely divergent state by state. So, in any case, over to Francis.
Yeah, maybe just a few comments at the company level where we make these comparisons. And what we can see right now is that the European leaders in terms of artificial intelligence are leaders on the global stage as well. They're not laggards compared to the US leaders. They are at the frontier that we can see as well in America. So I don't want here us to be too pessimistic. We can see European champions in the implementation of AI. Where we can see differences is when we zoom on one building block of having an efficient implementation of AI is cloud. And the way that cloud is implemented, what is interesting here is that we see that actually European companies are more ahead than American ones in terms of implementing workloads in the cloud. But where there is a difference where Europe is actually lagging compared to the US is that most of the European companies are focused on cloud and therefore AI as a cost play. It's to reduce cost. Whereas you've got more American companies which are looking at AI as a growth play. So innovating, creating more valid and valuable customer experience. And that's where we see the gap right now.
So that's a really interesting perspective. But I know many would argue that Europe doesn't have a large-scale cloud provider of its own. The Gaia X initiative hopes to change that. Do you think that we need to be a provider of cloud, or is it sufficient for us to be a sophisticated user?
Yeah, I would say the question is slightly different on the companies which invest there. It's not so much a question about where the cloud provider is coming from. It's more the way they intend to achieve their objectives related to AI, and the way that the AI implementation is going to contribute to superior growth. That's about that, really.
Thank you for that. Okay, well, I see that we are running to the end of our time, and in this case, I don't want to run us over because we would start to interfere with the keynote. Do any of you have a last closing remark, something maybe that I wasn't smart enough to ask?
I do have one, but it has nothing to do with your smartness, Scott.
Thank goodness.
It has to do with my inability to speak properly, because I just want to be clear to avoid any misunderstanding. I am not at all suggesting that we should not have social protection mechanism, whether the current ones or better ones or different ones, in order to cope with the effects of technological change, including artificial intelligence, particularly on categories of our citizens that are already quite vulnerable. Not at all. That is extremely important. And there, with all possible respect, I would think that Europe is actually ahead of the US in terms of thinking about these issues. What I was slightly pushing back is introducing a universal basic income in the conversation, because I just don't think that it brings any particular added value. And in fact, it tends to turn the conversation into a debate on what is universal basic income, rather than the much more pragmatic questions. We know that we have people at risk from many points of view, and technology might have a negative impacts for those people as well. On the other hand, artificial intelligence can also be incredibly helpful to make our social security systems much more efficient than they currently are in terms of identifying people in need, predict. That's tricky, but we can do something to predict people that might be in need or categories that might be in need in the future. So I just wanted to be clear on that point. I did not want at all to dismiss the use of social protection mechanism in a context of significant technological transformation, quite the contrary.
Thank you for that. I think that's very clear. And anything that we missed from Arturo or Francis?
No, just thanking you for a great moderation.
Oh, well, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and I hope our audience will thank the panelists for a wonderful panel.
Great.